What we've got here is a Stroudley Terrier, a bullied Pacific, and a British Rail Standard 4 tank. All steam driven, all seen here on the Bluebell Railway in Sussex, and all built in the same place. Brighton. Brighton Works built over 1,200 steam engines between 1852 and 1957, making their output greater than Ashford, Eastleigh and Nine Elms. But even though it closed in 1964, the spirit of Brighton Works has refused to die. Cue the music that definitely isn't from the opening of Quadrophenia for copyright reasons. This is the new, or should I say recreated, Brighton Atlantic number 32424 Beachy Head. It's been a site decades in reproduction and has given the UK its first standard gauge operational Atlantic of any kind since 1990. But the site itself predates even that. Last time a Brighton Atlantic was in service, Railway Roundabout was the newest thing on BBC television, and Lego had just started building bricks. A beetle was just a bug, a rolling stone was just a rock, and the who was just a question. So what's the history of the Brighton Atlantic locomotives? Why were none of them preserved? Why was this one chosen for recreation? And if it was, then so what? Our story begins all the way back in 1905, when the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway gained a new chief mechanical engineer, Douglas Earl Marsh. Marsh previously worked on the Great Northern Railway as the assistant to their CME, Henry Alfred Ivett. Ivett, of course, gave the GNR their own fleet of Atlantics, including the C1 and C2 classes. When Marsh arrived at Brighton Works, the LB&SCR consisted of sturdily built but quickly underpowered tank engines and very few tender engines for the big expresses. So within a few months, Marsh quickly drew up some copies of the Great Northern C1s with a few minor alterations. The boiler pressure was 25 psi higher, the cylinders were a little larger, the frames were 1 foot 3¼ inches longer, the firebox was a little shallower, it had air brakes and a bigger cab. The result was the first of the B5 class, later classified H and then H1 class, delivered in December 1905. 4 more examples followed over 2 months, costing £3,950 each. By 2024, this equated to just over 402 grand. So it was either one of these or a house. The stats of the H1s set them miles apart from previous Brighton machines. With a boiler pressure of 200 psi, 6 foot 7½ inch driving wheels, and a loco weight of 67 tons without a tender, their tractive effort peaked at just over £20,000. May not seem very high, but compared to engines like Stradley's B1s and RJ Billington's B4 class 440s, they proved miles ahead. Parts may not have been fully interchangeable, but performance made up for that. On the 30th of June 1907, number 39 managed to run from London Victoria to Brighton in 51 minutes and 48 seconds, and the top speed was just over 86 miles an hour. The same engine was chosen to haul King George V to Portsmouth in 1911, and the President of France in 1913. Unsurprisingly, the engine was named La France for the occasion. There followed a batch of 6 H2 class Atlantics in 1911. These had a few minor alterations, such as superheating and slightly bigger cylinders, which boosted their tractive effort by another 800 pounds. Such alterations must have been successful, because the H1s were later upgraded with superheating between 1925 and 27, by which time both H1s and H2s were all honoured with names. By this time you might be thinking, okay, but what about the Great Western? Surely they were building the more advanced 460 Saint class, right? Well, when the first Marsh Atlantic rolled out, G.J. Churchward had only built 3 of his Saints, all of which were different and still in the experimental stages. Meanwhile, Marsh's Atlantics were proving consistent performers right from the beginning. The LB&SCR did of course build Atlantic tank engines too, but these weren't quite as notable. First there was Marsh's I1s and I2 tanks, which could be best described as mobile steam heaters. Then there was the I4 class, which was just a slightly bigger mobile steam heater. Then there were the I3s, which were a little better, thanks to the addition of superheating and piston valves. But there's little denying the most successful of Marsh's Atlantic types were the H1 and H2s. The main purpose of these engines was to haul the railway's most prestigious service, the Brighton Limited. Renamed the Southern Belle in 1908, this all-Pullman dining train wasn't the first of its kind on the line, as the LB&SCR had been running Pullman cars all the way back in 1875. But it set the benchmark for luxury dining trains from London to the south coast over 2 decades before the Golden Arrow came along. With more traffic and stops than a rush-hour motorway, the Victoria to Brighton main line has always been considered a bit sluggish, which is probably why BR showed how you could ironically do the journey in 4 minutes. But in 1903, the LB&SCR timetabled a Pullman service on the 51-mile stretch in 48 minutes and 41 seconds. Even near the end of their lives, these engines could be full of surprises. With 325 tons behind her, number 32421 South Foreland was once clocked at 80.5 miles an hour through Haywards Heath. Talk about a sprint. And they could still fill in for the younger generations. In the early 1950s, Bulleid's new Pacifics were facing teething troubles, so on occasion, it was possible to see a H2 working on southwestern metals as far as Bournemouth. When you get the right driver on one of these, the noise they make is pretty good too. I mean, listen to this! For a fleet of just 11, the LB&SCR Atlantic tender engines proved a notable addition to the Southern Railway's fleet, albeit far from the least troublesome. When the design was conceived, the works capacity at Brighton was being overstretched, with yards of stored locos scattered around Sussex awaiting overhaul, so the first H1s were actually ordered from Kitson of Leeds. The H2s may have been younger and boasted superheating, but their boiler pressure was initially just 170 psi. Meanwhile, the older H1 type was considered more speedy. This was resolved when boiler pressures were increased in the 1930s, but by this time, their chimneys, domes and cab ventilators had to be cut down to allow them to travel on other parts of the southern system. The prestigious No. 39 La France, renamed Heartland Point in 1926, was infamously modified by Oliver Bulleid with a multiple jet blast pipe, fabricated chimney and sleeve valves as part of Bulleid's Leader project. But when Leader construction was cancelled and the remains were taken away for scrap, the Atlantic suffered the same fate in 1951. And when you look at rival machines of the period, the Brighton Atlantics come across as a bit old-fashioned by comparison. Not strictly in terms of appearance, but ergonomically. This Southeastern and Chatham goods engine is a classic case in point. You don't have to look very hard to see how much space there is between the frames. It still has inside cylinders and valve gear, but many other little bits and pieces, like this pump which is part of the steam reversing gear, are mostly exposed, giving you more space to work on them should they ever go wrong. But on a Brighton loco, everything is squashed, everything is hidden away. The safety valves are shrouded away because apparently that looks nicer. The air pump for the brakes is buried underneath the smoke box. Even the firebox is so cramped that the gap between the bottom of the brick arch and the top of the grate at the front is just 6 inches.
Okay, so the oil pots for the cylinders are on the outside. That's a blessing, but you've still got about 18 inches of running plate to lean across. So when you look at one of these compared to a Chatham C or the London and South Western 460 from a couple of years later, this engine seems a little bit too old-fashioned.
Mind you, the Atlantics got off lightly. Their designer though, that's another story. In 1911, Marsh became the subject of tabloid scrutiny. His relationship with his workforce was already not a happy one, so when allegations submerged of another Atlantic being ordered and never built, Marsh was suspected to pocket the money. This didn't seem to be proven, but the allegations led to Marsh's health deteriorating, and eventually he resigned at the end of the year. His place was taken up by Lawson Billington, who had been filling in for Marsh since he was effectively signed off. But before anyone assumes the H2s should be credited to Billington, the order was placed and the first 2 engines delivered when Marsh was still in office. But arguing over who built what was pretty insignificant, for the Brighton Atlantics would eventually have bigger things to worry about. The London to Brighton main line was electrified by January 1933, so long before BR's modernisation plan, the writing was on the wall for Brighton Steam. The Southern Bell service was fully electrified before changing its name to the Brighton Bell, which went on to run for a further 39 years, so the Atlantics were allocated to less prestigious workings along the network. Even World War II couldn't give them a full reprieve. The first of the H1s was withdrawn in January 1944, after just over 38 years in traffic. Those that remained into the 1950s began succumbing to worn cylinders and worn front bogie frames, leading to some of them being prematurely withdrawn. In 1956, No. 32424 Beachy Head was all that was left. She became a memorable sight on enthusiast specials, but despite her popularity, the last operational British Atlantic tender engine was withdrawn on the 24th of April 1958 and broken up the following month. Standard gauge railway preservation didn't take off in earnest for another 2 years, when the Middleton and Bluebell railways were established by bands of volunteers. But by then, Beachy Head and her sisters were all history. one of the earliest editions of the Bluebell Railway's journal described the loss of these engines as an irreparable catastrophe. So, what about the sight you see in this episode? How did that come about? In 1987, an old Great Northern Atlantic boiler was recovered from a sawmill at Malden in Essex. It was similar to that on Marsh's Atlantics, so the idea of building a new engine around it would become a little simpler and cheaper. The boiler in question was eventually brought to the Bluebell Railway and put into storage. Over the years, other Brighton bits and pieces were salvaged from long-lost engines, including a whistle, a regulator handle, interestingly from the original Beachy Head, the tender frames from an old Billington B4, and tender wheel sets from a Billington C2X. But the Brighton Atlantic project didn't officially launch until October 2000. The recreated engine utilised many 21st century production techniques, including the rods which were cut using water jets instead of forging, leaving a much smoother finish at a fraction of the price and preserving the molecular structure of the material. Then there's the cylinders, which were fabricated instead of cast. Skeptical engineers might point out this could compromise their lifespan, but it means there's fewer bulky wooden patterns to keep in storage, and they're easier to repair.
One, two.
24 years' work and £1.4 million later, the recreated No. 32424 Beachy Head moved under her own steam at the Bluebell's Sheffield Park workshops on the 6th of June 2024. Just over 2 months later, on August the 18th, the engine was handed over to the Bluebell Railway Preservation Society, ready to haul passengers for the first time in 66 years. It's really impressively done, but there is one small thing that the general public might not fully understand.
Britain has been awash with new-build steam engines in the 21st century. We've seen a new A1, a Saint, a Grange, a rail motor. The Corris Railway have 2 new steam engines. The Festiniog have been building new steam engines since the 1970s. So what makes Beachy Head stand out from the other new-build projects? After all, some bits of it aren't even new.
Well, other new build projects may recreate a site that hasn't been seen in living memory, but in a way, a working standard gauge Atlantic has been a little more sought after. A new Saint and a new Grange fill some gaps in the story of the Great Western 460, but barely a day has gone by without a Great Western 460 of some kind in traffic. A new Peppercorn A1 Pacific is a tremendous pioneering achievement, but preservation has tons of other Pacifics, including a similarly designed Peppercorn A2. The Corris Railway have made headlines for showcasing their new Falcon and Tattoo locomotives, but the Tallaght Lynn has been running both of those types since 1952. Beachy Head, on the other hand, offers a more unique experience. She's become the first working standard gauge Atlantic tender engine in the UK since 1978, when the Great Northern Railway C2 No. 990 Henry Oakley last ran. She's even the first working standard gauge Atlantic of any kind since 1990, when one of the Bluebell's other residents, Adams Radial Tank No. 488, was withdrawn from service. But she's so much more than a different wheel arrangement. She's a symbol of cottage industry engineering led by a small group of committed volunteers. And yet, despite being brand new, she somehow seems to belong.
Barely days into traffic, some people were saying it feels like this engine's always been here. So maybe there's something to be said for the right engine being in the right place.
future is unknown, which can make it both exciting and terrifying. So when progress doesn't go quite according to plan, there's always something to be said for reminiscing on the best bits of the past. And by recreating a piece of that past, the Brighton Atlantic Group have reignited a tangible piece of history that no picture or sound recording could ever imitate. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. If you like what you see and you'd like to see more, then feel free to like this video, share it amongst your friends, subscribe for more content, and discuss it in the comments or on social media. What's more, there's a whole back catalogue of over 50 episodes of Steam Locos In Profile available exclusive on Patreon. From as little as £3.50 a month, you can gain access to new videos up to a month in advance. Higher contributions get you the whole catalogue and feature-length and behind-the-scenes content. Or alternatively, Steam Locos In Profile is available on DVD and digital download from e-gmedia.co.uk/shop. Thanks a lot for watching, and don't ever stop being awesome.